Okay, market growth. So what we're really interested here is, okay, the transportation cost goes down. The market size increases. Okay, as we mentioned. All right, we lower the transportation cost, and then also the more population in urban areas also makes the market larger because now if I can get my goods to the urban areas, there's more people there. That's going to increase the market size. The real critical piece is how these larger markets lead to technological change. Okay, and we have direct evidence of this. So if you go back to kind of one of the initial lectures talking about the institutions needed for growth or the institutions needed for innovation, one of those is market access. Like you need to be able to get your product or your improved product to your consumers. The, the incumbents, you know, uh, in order for you to have market access, the incumbents can't keep you out. You need sort of regulations or institutions that allow new firms to enter the market. And that's important, but that's more important in the present, where companies have used government to keep competitors out. In this time period, we're talking about literal markets. Like we're talking about literally access to the market, because there's so many people in rural areas. Now the majority of people live in urban areas, and transportation costs are small. I mean, you think, in the present, it's crazy. I mean, it's like how easy it is to set up a company and get your product to consumers. Like you don't even need a store, right? You set up an Etsy, you eBay, yeah, Amazon for small business. I have actually lots of friends who have like small businesses that they run out of Amazon selling various things. You just set it up online, sell to you find your consumers via social media, and then you ship the goods to them. Shipping costs are again very low in the present, or it's very easy to ship stuff all over the world. I mean, especially in the US, but theoretically all over the world. We're talking in this time period, early 1800s. You're living on a farm. You're not really connected to the market. You got to walk to the town. That takes a while, right? Maybe there's a small good, like a small, whatever dry goods store there. But it's hard to, if you're an innovator and you're living in these like middle of nowhere places, it's really hard. You're just disconnected. You think about this in the present. A lot of developing countries or poor countries, their issue isn't like the level of innovation of the people living there. They're just disconnected. They just don't have a way of getting their crops or getting whatever new thing they come up with to the rest of the world or the rest of the country. So one of the striking things when you go to a poorer country is the lack of infrastructure. At least me. I mean, I haven't traveled in the developing world since the early 2000s when I did a lot. I basically spent a couple of years just traveling the world when I was young, before I was washed. And the striking thing when you're traveling through the developing world is just how poor the transportation networks are. And so you look at these rural villages that are poor, have low standards of living. They're just disconnected. I mean, they just if they were just connected to the market, and that specialization, that trade would increase the standard of living. And we see this as infrastructure gets built up, the standard of living goes up, and the people in these villages often know that. One of the things they're advocating for with their local government is, hey, please build a better road so we can get connected with the rest of the country. So in this context, in the early 1800s, we have this example of the Erie Canal. And so what we can see is these are the shaded areas are basically they're engaged in home production. They're making their clothes at home. This is what this means essentially. And so you can see most of these places that are disconnected from the Hudson River and the big cities of New York are making their goods at home. Once we get the Erie Canal, okay, you can see it's these areas that are disconnected where they have a higher percentage of making the goods at home. So once you're connected to the market, well, now you don't got to, we romanticize this kind of farm life where you're self-sufficient and you do everything yourself. But, you can go on YouTube and find tons of like funny videos where somebody tries to make a sandwich from scratch, from first principles, or a search, or a t-shirt. I think there's even a YouTube channel that just, this is what the YouTuber does. They just try to make things from scratch, and it's a disaster. It takes forever, super expensive. It's very low quality. It's just oftentimes better to specialize in what you're good at, buy everything else in the market. And that's what we see here. Okay, great. Again, we romanticize it, but these people are saying, finally, I don't have to knit my shirt myself. I could buy the shirt and I could just focus on what I do best, which is growing crops in this case. Okay, another even more striking thing is invention. We talked about patents before as a proxy for inventive activity, and here you can really see it. So again, the shaded area is more patents per capita. So there's basically not much patents going on in the hinterlands here. We get the Erie Canal, boom, people start inventing. Once there's a place where I can go and sell my invention, then I start the invention. We have a romanticized view of the inventor, and it's not totally mistaken. There are tinkerers, inventors working in their garage just for the sake of curiosity. But most invention, or a lot of an invention, takes place within the market context where I have to be able to sell it to somebody. If I'm working on an invention, ultimately I want to be able to sell it to somebody. If there's no market, oftentimes there's no invention. I mean, there's plenty of science and plenty of curiosity done strictly for just being curious, just desiring to know something. I mean, I'm not downplaying that, but when you look at invention and innovation, a lot of times it takes place in the context of being connected to a market, and the connection to the market spurs that innovation. Thinking about other people, thinking about what can I make that will make their lives better. That's oftentimes the spark that gets innovation going. And we see that here. Once the canal goes in, boom, the invention, starts popping off in this area around the Erie Canal. Okay. Last bit is we want to talk a little bit about tariffs or promoting manufacturing. Manufacturing generally, at least in this time period, you think about, countries start off as being agriculture, they move into manufacturing, and then as you get more developed, you sort of move into services, which is where the U.S. is now. It's mostly, most of the U.S. economy is service-based economy. But you think about manufacturing as an important step for countries to initially develop. And what is the role of the government to promote that manufacturing? Well, one, property rights. Obviously, we talked about the importance of physical intellectual property for getting, that initial level of capital investment and capital invention. You could do subsidies too. Or you could do direct purchase, like purchase agreements. The government agrees to buy something. I mean, this is basically what the government did with vaccines, where they had a purchase agreement. They said, look, whatever vaccine you come up with, we are going to buy it. We're going to buy X amount. We're going to buy 100 million or whatever it was. I think 100 million. I think 100 million at least of the Moderna. We're going to buy this vaccine. All right. That kind of gives that incentive to those companies to, okay, if we do this, we have at least our first buyer. And that, by the way, like that was, the government said that even if it doesn't work, we're going to buy it, but just to get you guys along the road. I mean, luckily for the U.S. government, all these vaccines worked. And then it was like, okay, now they only have, as I record this, only 3 are approved, but basically there are 2 other ones that work, that they have a bunch left over. And, now the debate is around what should we do with them. Ship them to the rest of the world would be a good idea, in my opinion, but yeah, whatever. We're not talking about policy here. We're not talking about vaccine policy. Okay. But this is one of the things they could do. Essentially, the government can give tax breaks to the manufacturing sector. Say, hey, if you start a manufacturing firm, we'll give you a bit of tax break. Government does this for all sorts of activity that it wants to encourage. Like solar panels have a tax break. A bunch of clean energy stuff, and the president has tax breaks. You could just subsidies. Hey, we're going to give subsidies out to people starting these businesses, again, or the direct purchase. The last one, which has become very, again, contentious as we get in the back half of the 20th century, is tariffs. And so what happens, just to give you some context of the intellectual debates, what happens in the back half of the 20th century is many economists argue for lower and lower tariffs, that basically free trade. We want goods to free flow between countries. And so the back half of the 20th century is one of lowering and lowering of global tariffs. We have seen a pushback to that from both the left and the right and the present, where you have your kind of Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party saying, we want higher tariffs. We want to, essentially, we want to protect American workers from competition. On the right, the populist right, essentially saying the same thing. And so we have this pushback to these tariffs, or to these lowering of tariffs in the present. So there's a bit of an intellectual or ideological battleground of the present over tariffs. And so, within that context, people go and look in the past to see what is the history of tariffs in various countries. Okay. And the U.S. has very high tariffs, at least when it's initially developing. Okay, and this really is, and again, I want to stress that the context is really different because in this time period, the government really has no other avenue to raise revenue. It's very hard to just have, there's no income tax, sales tax difficult. What they do in Europe, VAT tax, that's also difficult. A tariff is really the easiest way to raise revenue. Why is that? Well, you can see ships. If you're sitting on the shore, you can see a ship coming into harbor. So it's really easy to figure out when a ship comes in. It's also really really hard. I can't speak tonight. It's really hard to hide things on a ship. It's a ship, right? You walk on the ship, look around. That's what's on the ship. Could be hidden compartments or whatever, like in the first Star Wars, he's got the hidden compartment underneath it because it's a smuggling vessel. You can do that. Oh, actually, just watched a great documentary about surf trips in Indonesia and how they were like a cover for smuggling, and all these surf boats where people are going around finding ways, but underneath the hole, they're drug smuggling. So you can do that. You can have like the hidden compartments and whatnot. But it's difficult, and they're pretty easy to find if you kind of know what you're doing. So they're very easy to tax because the ship comes in. If I'm like the port, the customs agent, walk on the ship, look what's on the ship. I know what the value of the goods are. I have the prices. Okay, this ship is carrying X dollars of goods. Here's your tax, your tariff. Pay it, otherwise you can't unload the ship. It's very easy to stop people from unloading the ship. Also, you just put some guards around it. So just basically in this era, it's just hard for the government to raise revenue outside of tariffs. Tariffs are really the easiest way to do it. Now the argument for why you would want to do tariffs, that's why they do it. And then the argument about why would you want to do tariffs kind of in the present if you're a developing country? Well, the idea here is infant industry. You want to protect your sort of nascent domestic manufacturing from competition. Okay, so we're just started. We don't really know what we're doing yet. We're going to need to develop that capital, the physical capital and the human capital of knowing how to do this manufacturing. And so we need to grow it. So we need to protect it. We need to put some tariffs up, protect it from competition so they can grow. Once it's ready, we'll lower the tariffs and then our industry will compete. Okay. And so the infant industry argument in the present, it doesn't really have a good track record in terms of stimulating growth. Like that statement is a bit contentious, but you have this sort of industrial policy was pursued by Latin America in the mid 20th century. It's called ISI, import substitution industrialization. Didn't really lead to much growth. What happens is you protect your domestic industry from competition. That usually devolves into monopoly. So you kind of have one domestic manufacturer that's really inefficient and never really ready to compete on the global stage. That was at least the history of it as it was played out in the 20th century. But the proponents of tariffs all point to the U.S. experience and say, "Hey, why are you advocating for free trade when you yourself benefited from high tariffs initially? It was like what kind of got your industry off the ground." So the U.S. has pretty high tariffs, over 60% with this tariff, and manufacturing does increase. So people say, "Aha, you had high tariffs. This is when your manufacturing sector started to grow. So hey, they kind of put the causal relationship together. High tariffs equals manufacturing growth. Now the costs are, just these are the costs. Those tariffs, the manufactured goods will be of higher prices because they're going to be a tariff, or the domestic goods will be of higher prices. The demand for raw cotton will fall, and then in this particular area, it increases the conflict between North and South, as the South favors low tariffs since they are exporting, and the North is importing. All right, okay. Now, the difficulty again, I want to stress. So everybody points this out. Look, the U.S. advocating for lower tariffs, but they themselves benefit from higher tariffs. This may be true. This may be true that the manufacturing sector really got a leg up in the early 1800s due to these high tariffs. However, I would stress again that it's very, very different settings in the early 1800s when the government really doesn't have another avenue to raise revenue. and also versus the present when we really have lower global shipping costs. It's much, these many of these industries were really, their protection was how expensive it was to ship stuff overseas. And then also you have lots of evidence that the tariffs were not that responsible for the growth in the manufacturing sector, because you have also higher growth you have growth in non-traded sectors that were essentially higher. So that would suggest that the tariffs were not giving more of a benefit to the traded sectors. And then the UK in this time period has much lower tariffs, and they're growing apace. So it's not like the US was outpacing Europe because of its high tariffs. Sorry, the UK because of its high tariffs. The UK was growing, in a similar way. If you're interested in tariff policy, it's just much easier to just look at countries in the present or in the late 1900s, pre and post, agreements that lower tariffs, and see what happened in those countries. Okay, did they benefit or did they not benefit from those lower tariff rates? I mean, that's a much cleaner comparison. In this case, sometimes history is instructive, but in this case, it's much easier, I think, to look at developing countries in the present and their experience with tariffs rather than going back to the early 1800s. But if you want to, I can't stop you. All right, I can't stop people from making whatever arguments they want to make. Unfortunately, I don't have. Actually, fortunately, I'm very much in favor of the open exchange of ideas. Okay, all right, that does it this week for markets. See y'all when I see ya.